acting like good Democrats and following orders. Brazil's president, Lula, he was admonished in a New York Times headline that his effort with Turkey to provide a solution to the Iranian uranium enrichment issue outside the framework of U.S. power is what they called a spot on the Brazilian leader's legacy. In brief, do what we say or else. There's an interesting sidelight to all of this, which was effectively suppressed. That is that the Iran-Turkey-Brazil deal was approved in advance by the Obama administration, presumably on the assumption that it would fail, that would provide an ideological weapon against Iran. Actually, after the censure of Brazil, its Foreign Office released a letter from President Obama in which he had urged Brazil to proceed with it, expecting that it would fail. Well, when it succeeded, the approval turned to censure, and Washington rammed through a Security Council resolution, which is in fact so weak that China readily signed. And China, incidentally, is now chastised for living up to the UN resolution that it signed, but not living up to Washington's unilateral directives, which go well beyond it. It's in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, major foreign policy journal. Well, the U.S. can sort of tolerate Turkish disobedience, though with some dismay, but China's harder to ignore. The press warns that China's investors and traders are now filling a vacuum in Iran as businesses from many other nations, particularly in Europe, pull out. And in particular, China's expanding its dominant role in Iran's energy industries. Washington is reacting to this with a touch of desperation. The State Department warned China that if it wants to be accepted in the international community, which has the definition I mentioned, if it wants to be accepted in the international community, then it must not skirt and evade international responsibilities, which are clear. Follow U.S. orders. I'm sure that elicited some amusement in China's foreign offices. They're unlikely to be impressed. There's also a good deal of concern about the growing Chinese military threat. A Pentagon study came out recently, and it warned that China's military budget is approaching 1/5 of what the Pentagon spent to operate the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's, of course, a fraction of the U.S. military budget. They warned further that China's expansion of military forces might deny the ability of American warships to operate in international waters off its coast. That's off the coast of China. Nobody yet has declared that the U.S. should permit Chinese warships to operate freely in, say, the Caribbean, but got to understand why. China's lack of understanding of the rules of international civility was also illustrated by its objections to U.S. plans to send an advanced super aircraft carrier, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the George Washington, to join naval exercises a few miles off China's coast with capacity to attack Beijing with nuclear weapons. In contrast, the United States, the West generally, understands that such U.S. operations are legitimate. They're intended to defend stability in the technical sense. In the U.S., again, the liberal magazine New Republic expressed its concern that China sent 10 warships through international waters just off the Japanese island of Okinawa, which is indeed a provocation, unlike the fact that they didn't mention that Washington has converted Okinawa into a major U.S. military base in defiance of vehement protests by the population, which still continue. That's not a provocation on the standard principle that we own the world. So how could that be a provocation? Well, putting aside deep-seated imperial doctrine, which is so deep-seated that people can't even perceive it, even progressives and so on, you just can't see it. But let's put that aside. There is good reason for China's neighbors to be concerned about its growing military and commercial power. And going back to the Middle East, although Arab opinion strongly supports an Iranian nuclear weapons program, it doesn't mean that we should. We certainly shouldn't. And the foreign policy literature is full of proposals as to how to counter the threat. There is an obvious way, which is never discussed. That is to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region, or at least move in that direction. That would do a lot to mitigate, maybe end whatever threat there is. Well, that issue does arise outside the West. It arose again at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference last May. It's meeting every 5 years. Egypt, which was the chair of the non-aligned countries, 118 countries, it called for negotiations on a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. Actually, that had already been agreed to by the West at the 1995 review conference, but they never did anything about it. International support for this was so strong that President Obama had to formally agree. So it's a fine idea. Washington informed the conference, but this isn't the right time for it. So someday, when the Messiah comes. Furthermore, see, I notice my environment. Furthermore, the United States made it clear that Israel must be exempted from the nuclear weapons-free zone. So the Obama administration explained that no proposal can call for Israel's nuclear weapons-free program to be placed under the auspices of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or it can call for release of information about Israeli nuclear facilities and activities. That's out. Otherwise, it's a great idea someday. Well, so much for that method of dealing with the Iranian nuclear threat. While grand area doctrine still prevails, as in these cases, the capacity to implement it has declined. The peak of U.S. power was right after World War II. At that point, the U.S. literally had half the world's wealth in a position of unimaginable security and military power. Well, that naturally declined. Other industrial countries reconstructed from the devastation of the war. Decolonization took its agonizing course. By the early 1970s, the U.S. share of global wealth had declined to about 25%, still enormous, but not 50%. By that time, early 70s, the industrial world had become what's called tripolar economically. North America, Europe, and East Asia, which at that time was Japan-based. There was also a sharp change in the U.S. economy in the 1970s, Europe as well, but particularly striking in the U.S., towards financialization of the economy and export of production. There's no time to go into the details, but they're interesting and important. What really happened is that a variety of factors converged to create a vicious cycle of radical concentration of wealth in the U.S. that's by now literally in a fraction of 1% of the population. That's what's causing the huge inequality. That means mostly CEOs, managers, hedge fund managers, people like that. Concentration of economic power leads almost automatically to concentration of political power. That yields a capacity to formulate state policies that increase the economic concentration. means fiscal policies like taxation, rules of corporate governance, deregulation, much else. So you do get a vicious cycle, sharp concentration of power in the economy and the political system, and continuing because they reinforce each other. Meanwhile, the costs of electoral campaigns skyrocketed. The next campaign, 2012, is anticipated to cost $2 billion in the United States. That drives the political parties into the pockets of concentrated capital, which is increasingly financial capital. The Republicans reflects it. The Democrats, who are by now what used to be called moderate Republicans, they're not far behind. In fact, elections have become almost a total charade. Take the 2008 election, which Obama won. As you may know, shortly after the election, he won a second victory. He won an award from the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of 2008. Executives were euphoric in the business press. They explained that they'd been marketing candidates like toothpaste ever since Reagan, but this was their greatest achievement. It would change the style in corporate boardrooms and so on. Well, 2012 election is going to be more extreme. So it's not surprising that Obama is now selecting business leaders for his top positions. That's where the money is, hence the political power. The public is quite angry and frustrated, but as long as the Muasher principle prevails, that doesn't matter in our conception of democracy. Well, wealth and power have narrowly concentrated in the past roughly 30 years, but for the general population, real incomes have stagnated, working hours have gone sky high, support systems have declined. People have been getting by more or less, but it's with increased work hours, far beyond Europe by now, with debt, and with asset inflation, which is regularly destroyed by the financial crises that began as soon as the regulatory apparatus left by the New Deal was dismantled. There weren't any financial crises in the 50s and 60s and 70s. There were several during the Reagan years. They've been getting worse ever since. Most recently, the huge crash that we're still in the middle of, basically. Well, none of this is problematic for the very wealthy because they benefit from a government insurance policy. It's called too big to fail, which is an insurance policy. What it means is that the banks and the investment firms, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, their equivalents in Europe, they can make very risky transactions. Risky transactions yield rich rewards. And when the system crashes, as it's inevitably going to do, they can run to the nanny state for a taxpayer bailout, clutching their copies of Hayek and Milton Friedman and so on. Now, that's been a regular process since the Reagan years, each crisis more extreme than the last, for the population, that is. So right now, in the United States, unemployment is literally at the level of the Great Depression for much of the population. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs, one of the main architects of the current crisis, is richer than ever. It just quietly announced $17.5 billion in compensation for last year. CEO Lloyd Blankfein gets a $12.5 million bonus, and his base salary more than tripled. It's just in England for the last couple of days, and front page of the newspaper every morning is the same story, Barclays Bank and the rest of them. Yeah, that's great. That's what happens with a government insurance policy. Well, obviously it wouldn't do to focus attention on things like this. So propaganda has to find ways to blame others. In the past few months in the United States, it's been to blame public sector workers, their fat salaries, exorbitant pensions, and so on, all total fantasy. But